So to kind of recap a bit Kant's project, he is looking for a universal law of morality, a way to answer a key moral question: what should I do? And he'll do this not by looking to everyday experience, but to rules or a law that reason can establish by itself. And he ends up sketching what's called the categorical imperative, an unconditionally binding command that human reason gives to itself. And the first formulation of this was act only in accordance with that maxim according to which you can will, at the same time that it become a universal law. So today, hopefully, we'll kind of go into some greater depth about what that means. I'm going to contrast, because it's not a familiar user-friendly term, the categorical imperative, contrast it with some other alternative ways to think about morality, and then get to the different formulations that Kant provides in the reading for today of the categorical imperative. And there's a kind of progressive way of looking at the formulations. I think one way is that he starts out highly abstract, but then sort of injects humanity into the picture, brings the moral law closer to feeling with each new iteration. So the iterations that we're going to talk about are sort of, the shorthand is on this slide. The first one, which we talked about last week, we'll talk a little bit more about today, is sometimes it's considered the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative. The second one, which Maya already brought up, and I'm very glad she did, is known as the humanity as an end in itself formulation, which I would say, and it's really this second one that makes Kant special and interesting to me. Because there's a way to view it as grounding so many human rights that we seem to cherish today in this formulation of always using people as regarding people as ends and never as means to something else. And then there's another formulation known as the realm of ends, which, for lack of a better way of putting it, might be considered kind of politicizing, expanding the kind of human element that we're introduced to in the second formulation. So one key dimension to all of this, which isn't in the PDF with the excerpts, but it was in the second Kant PDF, that's the full text. So if you had a chance to peruse that, then you may have come across Kant's discussion of free will. And so that's the other key dimension. Because surely, if we are in a realm talking about evaluating moral worth, it's like some act and trying to understand what makes something morally worthy or morally unworthy. There seems to be an assumption that the beings involved in all this have to have free will. So Kant does talk about that explicitly. But so before I kind of try to encapsulate Kant's view on free will, a classic theme in philosophy, you all tell me, do human beings have what is free will, and do we have it? Okay, Maya, I see your hand raised, please.
I would say free will is our ability to consciously choose what we do. And in my personal opinion, I think we have a little bit of it, but less than we think we do.
Got it. I really like that because I kind of agree. Edwin.
No, I was about to say the same thing, is what you choose to act on, and pretty much something that makes you either agree or this. I mean, no, not that one. But yeah, pretty much what she says. Sorry,
Power
I'm a
to
little.
act. So yeah, some of the attributes seem to be consciousness, awareness, and ability to act on oneself. Did I see another hand raised? I thought I saw Sam had a hand raised a moment ago. Take it away, Sam, or not.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think that Maya summed it up really well. That I think that I think we definitely have some sense of free will, like to an extent. Like we definitely think we have more because we're like, oh well, I can choose what I want to wear in the morning. But like for example, if somebody wanted to leave their house without any clothes on, it's like, well, you can't do that. Like you don't have that extent of free will. Like I think because of societal norms and things like that, that the idea of free will has been purposefully like narrowed down to like what is societally acceptable to do. Um, and so like I think that definitely we have an illusion of free will, but it's not as like the truest definition of free will is not something that we live in like day to day.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense that society infringes on our actions. What else infringes on our actions?
Well, I guess the most obvious one would be like, since most of us aren't really, uber rich and stuff, there's only so much we can really do and get away with.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like it's all well and good to say we have free will, but if you don't have the capacity to act on it, what good is it? And yeah, money is a
Yeah.
huge barrier. I would love to fly to go on a cruise tomorrow. It's like, but I can't. I don't have the money. So
I mean,
there's
realistically, you can technically do anything until you get caught.
yes, yeah. So so that's kind of seems to bring things back to the sort of societal restrictions Sam was talking about. So there's a mix of so there's limited capacities. There's limits society imposes. What would science? Is there any way science could help us shape our understanding of free will?
Yeah, I think the what I meant about us having less than we thought, I mean, society definitely comes into it, but I actually also meant like our subconscious. I think that really super shapes why we do what we think we want to do. Like our childhood, our experiences, it all shapes the decisions we make.
Yeah. So in a few weeks, we're going to talk about Freud, who's very much into the subconscious. I think it's a good question to what extent does the subconscious, if we think it exists, which I tend to, to what extent does it restrain us? To what extent maybe does it free us? I mean, because psychoanalysis is all about kind of unearthing the demons from one's subconscious and maybe attaining the kind of freedom. So yeah, the scientific themes that are kind of emerging to me are how what science can show us about how the consciousness operates, which I think are great points. And as far as the free will problem goes, I mean, it's as old as time. Billions of words have been written about it. It's an unresolved question today. It was basically, I think, broadly speaking, the kind of different schools of thought on what free will is are free will purists who think human beings have absolute free will, that there are a school that's kind of absolutists, which means humans are totally devoid of free will, and then something in between, often called compatibilist, which says humans are confronted with a combination of the two. In Kant's terms, he seems to divide existence into almost two realms. One that seems to suggest people are radically free, and another which suggests they are radically unfree. And it's the latter realm, alarmingly, is the day-to-day world of ordinary experiences, which he says can be sort of reduced to an endless chain of causes, scrutiny of which shows no evidence that there's free will. So, it could be a bit arbitrary where you pick as a starting point, but to give a sense of this world of absolute unfreedom that Kant entertains. let's say with birth, no one chooses to be born. And you can, and then it just becomes a question of how, to what level of minutia do you want to scrutinize things? Could say we woke up, each of us woke up today because our alarm clock went off. Then we had breakfast or didn't have breakfast, had coffee or whatever, because there was a biological impulse to have those things. Then we logged into class because we signed up because we want to get a degree. Then after class, we will maybe unwind by streaming something. But when we stream something, it's options are offered up to us based on an algorithm which dictates our taste, which in turn is formed by all kinds of influences outside of our control. So there's a way in which you could view reality, according to Kant, as an endless chain of causes where there's basically no room for free will. Every action that an individual does can be attributed to tons of other factors, none of which is free will. And that, according to Kant, is the realm of phenomena, basic day-to-day things. Okay, I see two hands raised. I see some hands raised. Yes, Sam.
Yeah, I think a really interesting thing that I think connects back to this is like the idea of advertising. That I think about this all the time when I see an ad like on Instagram or something, where it's just like I find myself like sitting back and like actually watching the ad, and then it's like the ad is just like a video of someone being like, oh my God, I bought the sweater and it's so cute and matches everything, and like, oh my God, I've had it for like 2 years and it hasn't even worn at all, like it's so nice, da, da, da. And then like I find myself being like me, wow, like maybe that sweater like matches some of my jeans, like, and then I like pause for a second, I'm like, wait, they got me. Like I think that like that's a really interesting conversation to have in terms of like, I guess the streaming is what reminded me of that, is like in terms of like algorithm and marketing and stuff, is that we have this illusion of like, oh, you can choose what you want to buy or you can choose what you want to watch, but really it's just like it's all heavily suggested. Like it's heavily suggested that you buy this and heavily suggested that you watch this because other people liked it or other people watched it or because we want you to watch it or because we want you to buy it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the view Kant presents of, a phenomenal world in which there's no free will, it's just an endless chain of cause and effect, basically would maintain that your example, Sam, of the way advertising influences and coerces our behavior applies to all of reality. Yeah, that's a great example. Alan, I see your hand raised as well. Okay, I thought I saw it raised. So
sorry.
yeah,
Do you think Kant would be like do you think he would, I guess, argue against the like destiny and stuff like that?
so that goes directly with the other world that he seems to sketch, the world of noumena.
Mhm.
So we could think of the first one we're talking about, the world of phenomena, as it's sometimes called a deterministic world. Everything is determined by cause and effect. One could also think of it as destiny, although destiny suggests a bit to me like a bit of a religious aspect. So I would be more inclined to call it determinism than destiny. But I mean, we could bring religion in. A religious determinist would say that the endless chain of cause and effect is a matter of destiny. But Kant does present an alternative to that. The term he applies to it is noumena, thinkable things. And he seems to suggest that it is only in the realm of thinkable things occupied by reason that freedom exists. It's only in terms of thought that there is freedom, which maybe on an intuitive level makes a bit of sense to me. Yes, there are, some of the examples that we were just talking about: social pressure, financial obstacles, material barriers. And we can think of many, many more examples that show how restricted action is. even if we don't even have to go all the way to a determinist realm of endless cause and effect. But on the other hand, on some intuitive level, to me, it does make sense that thoughts are free. That even if I can't do everything I want to do, I can think anything I want to think, right?
That's true.
Or to try to put it in a bit more in Kant's terms, because so much of the thrust of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals seems to have to do with separating a realm of morality and reason from the day-to-day world of cause, effect, inclination. It's the former. It's reason alone that has freedom in this realm of thinkable things. It's where people are able to make their own decisions. So it might seem arbitrary, but these are basically the two realms Kant is putting on the table for us. And there's also a strong suggestion, going back to the categorical imperative, that in order to act on it, in order to have one's actions be evaluated as morally worthy or morally unworthy, we need to have free will. And a lot has been written about where Kant ultimately falls on the sort of achievability of the categorical imperative. Because again, he said people have to have free will in order to take moral actions, but he's also kind of sketched this world of endless chain of cause and effects that seems to deprive humanity of the possibility of free will. An interpretation that I like about Kant's moral philosophy is that even if we live in a world that's determined by endless chain of cause and effects, on the moral level, we as rational beings have to adopt this kind of stance that we have free will to act on reason. And so it may not always be the case that we have free will, but in the important moral cases, we have to assume that we do. Otherwise, there's no possibility of morality at all. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hopefully it's the phenomena and noumena distinction really comes up a lot more in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason that I mentioned passing last week. Hopefully I've done justice to it today, but I think that would be a kind of key thing. Phenomena, world of everyday experience, endless chain of cause and effect, suggests a deterministic world with no free will. Noumena, thinkable things where reason operates, suggesting that there is free will. Which we are in is something that's still, believe it or not, a debate alive to this day. So I promise we'll get to the other formulations of the categorical imperative, but I do want to recap some of what we've already said about duty and this key idea in Kant that actions are moral only if they are done out of duty, in contrast to actions that are done out of any kind of inclination or desire. So maybe before talking a bit more specifically about Kant's idea of duty, you all tell me, I mean, I've already put there's a few examples on this slide, but what are examples of duty in day-to-day life? Do we have any duties?
Paying bills really, or taking care of others.
Yeah. Is that a responsibility or a duty or both?
A bit of both.
I like the taking care of others example. So what makes you say taking care of others would be a duty?
Because, like, I guess with the example of free will, you can honestly just not do it and just walk away if you wanted to.
Sure.
but it's also, again, both a responsibility and a duty for you to actually be there for them.
Yeah. So do you have in mind family members or society in general, or because there
Yeah.
are people who say there's a duty to help others?
I
What do you
guess, using you as an example, you being an educator, that would be a duty because you would rather, I don't know, part knowledge onto others.
Hmm.
Come on, give me something.
I like that. No, I like that example. I'm not going to say no to that. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that teaching can be understood as a matter of duty. What about from a student's point of view? Is there a duty to?
I guess up to a point, really, because most of us were forced to really stay here from like pre-K to when we're 18.
Right. But at this stage, yeah, absolutely. Undergraduate is totally voluntary. So in what sense would there be a duty to get an undergraduate degree?
I guess, like for me at least, since I'm first gen, it'd be, I don't know, I think it would be like wise for me to, I don't know, further on my education because I've seen how, I guess, my parents were when they first got here working.
Yeah.
And be better for me to just not necessarily continue that cycle onwards.
Yeah. I mean, that strikes a chord with me because my parents are also like immigrant background. Like my mom's born overseas. So like, yeah, in my household, there was like not even a question. They're like, you have to go to college. But it's interesting. Yeah. So it can be that seems like a great example of having a duty. Any other examples come to mind? Either Alan or anyone else? What are duties in day-to-day life? Or even not with us personally? What about in society? Do we see anyone who seems to act out of duty?
Well, I said on the chat, like giving the seats to an elder, but I don't think that's a moral. I think that's a moral
Sorry,
duty
doing what?
giving the seats to elderly people.
Right. In what sense is that a duty?
It's more of I think of a moral standard that we must do to by society rule of, I think, of giving it, which some people don't do it, but I feel it is.
So the basic idea is respect your elders and maybe sometimes help your elders.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's built into national policy. I mean, there's Social Security, and I always mix them up, but I want to say Medicaid is the health system for people over 65. So it seems like society as a whole in the US has said there is a duty to care for the elderly. Yeah, I think that's another great example. How about one more? Okay, yes, Maya.
I put this in the chat, but I guess just sort of I feel like duties can often be what you assign yourself. So just doing what you said you were going to do, following through on promises. Just sort of, yeah, being consistent, I guess.
Yeah. It sounds right to me in general. But then I kind of want to make it a bit more abstract. It's like, yeah, you have to follow through when you promise to do something. If it's like, I'm going to take care of my nephew and niece, or babysit them, or I'm going to do the homework assignment or something like that. But to make it more abstract, is that a duty to oneself or to others or both?
I would say both because it's sort of being the kind of person who does what they say they're going to do is should be important to yourself, but at the same time, I mean, I personally find it a lot easier to follow through with what I say I'm going to do for others than to like go with like the, I don't know, New Year's resolution where I'm like, oh, I'm totally going to go to the gym just for me. So I feel like in a way duties feel more important when they're for others than when they're just for me.
Yes. Yeah, the more I'm thinking about what you're saying, the more it strikes me as like just actually a very Kantian idea. Because, okay, so the idea of the first iteration of the categorical imperative is that it orders nothing other than lawfulness itself, is one way of understanding it. You know, when Kant states, act only in accordance with that maxim according to which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law, it just means act in a morally lawful way. I mean, I think similarly what I'm hearing from you, Maya, this idea that duty is following through on your word, it just strikes me as almost like the perfect abstraction for what duty is. It's that it's not something that has a specific content, but it's being dutiful itself. And that idea of duty takes on more substance when it's in a context of interacting with other human beings, which will bring us to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. So what I would say is I really like all of these examples. Other than Maya's like very Kantian conception of duty, a lot of examples according to Kant, or I should say Kant has something in mind different from a lot of the ideas of duty encountered in day-to-day life. So the ones I have here are citizen soldiers, Girl and Boy Scouts, are roles often understood in terms of duty. And actually, as a citizen, there's like very few duties involved. Basically, to pay taxes and to, in the US, to answer a jury if you're summoned. Soldiers have duties to follow orders, defend this hill, shoot that enemy, whatever. Girl and Boy Scouts, I never did the Scouts, but I gather that it's a very duty-oriented organization that tries to, cultivate young people to like be responsible to other members of society. But for Kant, none of those are, he means in mind something that's significantly different. Each one of those examples of duty seems to imply some goal, something that the person executing the duty desires to achieve. So in the case of a soldier, if they're ordered to defend this hill, they might do their duty because they're afraid of getting their commanding officer's wrath and being punished. Or maybe a girl and a Boy Scout will do their duty of I'm not exactly sure what Girl and Boy Scout duties are, but it's the sort of cliche image I have in mind is helping the elderly person cross the street. They may be executing a duty, but Kant would point out they have there might be ultimate desires and motives that kind of dilute the purity of this duty. So in the case of a girl or Boy Scout, maybe it's because they want to get a patch for being helpful. I think the key thing for Kant is that for him, truly acting from duty has to ignore the outcome of one's actions. Just goes back to the idea of morality, his moral law being something that commands lawfulness itself. It is an action for Kant done from duty, or an action for Kant is only morally worthy if it is motivated by desire to perform one's duty and nothing else. So the problem with going back to these examples of a soldier or a girl or a Boy Scout is the problem in evaluating the kind of moral worthiness of their actions is there will always be a kind of galaxy of additional possible motives and desires that motivate them. So those are not examples of pure duty in the sense that Kant has in mind. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I'm explaining it quite right.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, to me, Kantian morality almost suggests this world where the desire to be moral is in opposition to all these other inclinations you might have, even if they are seemingly good ones. And that what he's really trying to establish a pure idea of morality that is not contingent on desires that may push and pull us in different directions. And that may be the sort of one of the virtues of Kant's philosophy, is that he's trying to sketch a way to evaluate moral conduct that is not kind of pulled all over the place by other motives. Because again, going back to the world of phenomena, there's endless just stuff in day-to-day existence. And it would almost be, you know, we could spend a lot of time scrutinizing any individual action. It's like, what really motivates someone to do something? It's like, if a soldier does something brave and wins the Purple Heart, did they really do it out of it for seemingly noble reasons, or did they do it so they could get a promotion or win an award or help a friend? You know, maybe they were saved another soldier. Hear about that from time to time. There are all these outside possible motives that seem to go into human conduct. But I think Kant is, again, trying to assert a moral law that has this kind of very pure foundation of adherence to duty. I'm going to briefly contrast this sort of absolute form that Kant's moral law takes with alternatives. So, like we were talking about last week, his articulation of the moral law is that it's a categorical imperative. Categorical meaning no ifs, ands, or buts allowed. Imperative conveying that it is a command to a rational being, specifically that a rational being gives oneself. I was trying to articulate with this idea of duty is that, you know, part of ignoring outcomes of an action, this Kant's phrasing is categorical imperative has not to do with the matter of action and what is to result from it, but with the form and the principle from which it results. In contrast, our hypothetical imperatives, commands that are contingent on things like desires, which can be fleeting, which can be conflicting. They convey the seeming necessity or urgency of an action to attain something else that you want. So an example might be, don't ever take sides with anyone against the family. This is a hypothetical that's contingent on, you know, the person saying it or hearing it being in favor of the family. Like, what if you have a falling out? Or what if there's a divorce? All other kinds of things could kind of break up the foundation of this hypothetical imperative and make it lose its validity. So it's contingent. It does have ifs, ands, or buts. So Kant, again, will be going for a moral law that admits of no ifs, ands, or buts. And there's a way you can kind of extrapolate from the first iteration of the categorical imperative an almost multi-step process of evaluating a specific action and trying to determine its moral worth. So that would start by turning a proposed plan of action into a kind of maxim. So going back to the predatory lending example, let's take it from the point of view of a lender. If a bank takes the action of giving out a loan to a student the bank knows will never be able to repay it, they've implied a maxim that simply, it's kind of simple, but it's worth stating it to sort of clarify Kant's philosophy here. It is acceptable for me, the bank, to give loans to students who I know cannot repay them. So then the next kind of step would be reframing that individual maxim into a universal law to see if it can stand. So the universal form of a maxim, it is okay for me, a bank, to give loans to students I know will be unable to repay them, might be something like, it is okay for all banks to give out loans to students that they know will not be able to repay them. And then where the sort of duties come into focus is by considering whether or not the universal form of a given maxim is even conceivable. So in the case of predatory lending, I believe Kant would say that it is inconceivable because, in his terminology, if all banks gave out loans to students who they knew were incapable of paying them, that would destroy the possibility of any promise keeping at all. I mean, the way he talks about promises is from kind of more from the other end. If someone takes out a loan knowing he or she will not be able to repay it, and asserts a maxim that it's fine for all rational beings to do that, then that destroys the possibility of promise keeping in the world and is therefore, in Kant's phrasing, inconceivable. There are other cases where a universalized maxim might be conceivable and kind of pass the third step here, but would be what Kant would term irrational. So the example there would have to do with like giving charity. We can make it more localized. Okay, so if you live in New York City, you see homeless people all the time. So the question becomes, do you give them some money or food? So I think the way to phrase it in Kant's term would be, if, from the perspective of someone who decides not to give money to a homeless person. If I make that decision, when I step out of the street after this class, homeless person asks me for money and I say no, I'm asserting a maxim that it is fine for me not to give money to the homeless, even though I do. I have a few bucks. I could do it, but I've decided not to do it. So then kind of step two would be something like, it is okay for all rational beings not to give money to the homeless, even if they have a few bucks on them. And then sort of step three is that maxim conceivable in a rational world? And Kant would say, I think, that it is perfectly conceivable for rational beings not to give money to the homeless even when they have it. So in a sense, it passes the third test, the third sort of step here. But then, so it's conceivable, but then the question is it rational? And Kant would claim that it is irrational to will a world in which all beings, even when they have money, do not give money to the homeless. So what results is a duty to do that thing, which you cannot rationally state should be done all the time, at least some of the time. So there's a sort of different kind of species of duties that result from this. Ones that are, if there's a maxim that is inconceivable, then you have what Kant would term a perfect duty not to do that. Another example for Kant, pretty provocative, but he'll say suicide is something that, just as people have a duty to never break promises, they have a duty never to commit suicide, according to Kant. But then imperfect duties include not only giving charity to others at least sometime, but also that example we talked about in passing last week, cultivating one's talent. You can conceive of a world in which all beings do not cultivate their talent, but Kant would contend it is irrational to act on that maxim. And that gets into a particular, his sort of quirky, idiosyncratic way of conceiving of what nature is. So it's debatable, but Kant would say that there is a duty to at least some of the time cultivate one's natural talents. So this finally brings us, these are the cases we talked about last week, but I would like to get to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which I think, if you've gotten the impression, which I always get from Kant, that the first formulation of the categorical imperative can be very abstract. It can also sound very severe. It's really the second formulation that seems to bring humanity into the picture. And with someone who maybe hasn't spoken yet, like to read the quote in italics near the top. Don't be shy, just go for it. Tangina, please.
You're talking about the first one, right? With the verse numbers, the 4, 4,
Yes.
2, 9? Okay. Act so you can use humanity as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time as end, and never merely as means.
Okay, thank you, Tangina. So Kant curiously states that this formulation is identical with the first one, which is debatable, but we can set that aside and just for now ask, what does this mean? How would all of you interpret this? Maya, please.
Just like everyone's a human being, and don't dehumanize them, don't like treat them like they're less important than you are.
Yes. So what in these terms does it mean to dehumanize someone?
To sort of treat them as like a way to get something.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. Here Kant seems to be saying that the universal moral law commands respect for other members of humanity, not because of, nothing in this says anything about social roles, personal roles, anything like that, but only because they are other rational, or we could say human beings. And that alone demands a great deal of respect. Okay, so I see a hand raised. Okay, Free Palestine. You could definitely put a lot of contemporary political problems in Kantian terms. And it's actually, I am not one to shy away from controversy. So Shihab, it's the third formulation that I would argue makes the categorical imperative more explicitly political. I mean, one interpretation of the third formulation is that it's the basis for the United Nations. So if you want, when we get to the third categorical imperative, we can go back to the crisis in Palestine. But for now, any other thoughts on what this sentence means?
I guess in the simplest way of interpreting is just do unto others as you would unto yourself. Rather, do unto others as you would want to, you know,
No, I mean, I think you're getting there. I mean, with the first thing you were saying, yeah, there's a lot in common with between the categorical imperative and what you're saying, Alan, which is basically the golden rule. What I like about the categorical imperative is that built into it in a way more than the golden rule
Mhm.
is, I would say, an explanation for why categorical imperative should be done. So like when you get the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, why would I want to do it?
Yeah.
It's just you're just like telling me to do this without an explanation, like why. And so like I guess when you're a kid and someone tells you something, like why you should like do this, but they don't necessarily give you a reason why.
Yeah.
I guess that would be more of like an explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with this formulation of the categorical imperative in particular, Kant, there's a built-in explanation, justification, whatever we want to call it, for why someone should act this way. Namely, it's spelling out that rational beings, human beings, are almost intrinsically, by definition, worthy of being treated as ends in themselves and not just a means to be manipulated to something else. And there are like a billion examples that I think we could use to try to bring this to life. I mean, why shouldn't you lie? Okay, there are lots of corny reasons I could think of for why you shouldn't lie to someone. But I think this is a very powerful reason. And we could even, plenty of times in experience, that it seems like a lie is harmless. So how is it that Kant could say, as he does, you should never lie? Which again, that is a crazy idea to me. I don't know anyone who has never lied. I mean, I try not to lie, but it comes up, Kant is giving, I think it contains a reason to truly never lie, which he is spelling out that when you lie to someone, even if you can explain it away as harmless, you are not respecting their humanity. You're degrading them into an instrument for your own goals and not respecting them as rational beings. So I could lie to get out of a boring dinner, and maybe I lie instead of saying the reality, which is half the guests bore me or something. I don't know. It's a bit corny, but that's what comes to mind. Kant would say I should not do that because the person I'm lying to as a rational being, in a sense, has a right to know the truth, to not be deceived. I don't know, maybe any other examples come to mind? I mean, one thing is that this is to say a little bit more about why I think Kant does give a powerful moral philosophy is that there's sort of broadly two kind of senses in which one could interpret the second iteration of the categorical imperative. There's a negative sense, which might remind us a little bit of John Locke. It says the second formulation imposes a limit on what you can do to yourself and others. So we could even drop this sort of moral mechanism that comes from the first formulation of the categorical imperative and just interpret this one to very clearly mean if an action entails treating someone as a means and not an end, it is not moral. The reason it reminds me of Locke is, Locke asserted these kind of limited rights to personhood and property, which implied like a restriction on what people could do to one another. So I think in a simple sense, the categorical imperative, this formulation means something similar, but it also seems to be richer. There seems to be a positive sense, which I think comes when you start to ask, what does it mean to treat oneself and others as an end and not as just a means? So in the case on an individual level, if I treat myself as an end, that starts to make it make sense why Kant would say there is a duty to cultivate one's talents. And it might sound weird, but there's nothing wrong with it sounding weird, I think, that let's say there's time I could decide to go to a party or study. Okay, again, maybe a slightly corny example, but I think it's clear cut. If I decide to go to a party instead of studying, there's a sense in which I have, in Kant's term, used myself to get some pleasure instead of respecting myself as an end with goals. It's a bit odd, but I mean, there's ways you could think of actions toward oneself as being differentiated between, are you treating yourself as a means? Are you using yourself? Kind of strange. Or are you respecting yourself as a rational being with goals? Similarly, this formulation of the categorical imperative seems to command people to, when it commands people to respect each other as ends, the minimal sense would be, don't harm others, don't kill people or steal their property, as Locke would say. But the positive sense would be something like a command to actually help others achieve their goals. This is where it will start to get very political. What are human rights? What do we base them on? Do we take a short list of human rights and say it's just not, a right not to be killed or not to be stolen from? Or are there more expansive rights? Is there a right to healthcare? Is there a right to education? Is there a right to marry who you want to marry? I think, Kant puts us in a much better position to argue for those things, by giving us this positive sense of the second formulation of the categorical imperative than other philosophers like Locke might. There's basically a whole apparatus here for articulating rights. If you can make a case that a given action is key to respecting other human beings as ends in themselves, as full-fledged persons, then you can kind of come up with a whole schedule of rights for human beings. So as you can probably tell, this is where I start to really like and appreciate Kant. And even though he definitely has blind spots, we'll probably talk to in a few weeks in the context of philosophy of race, I do think that this formulation in particular gives a very powerful basis for human rights and why there should be human rights. So kind of the last formulation, it's phrased two different ways, but it's often grouped under one umbrella. Can be called the formula of autonomy or the formula of the realm of ends. This is at the very end of the PDF of excerpts, in which Kant states, a conception of every rational being as one which must consider itself as giving in all the maxims of its will universal laws, so as to judge itself and its actions from this point of view. This leads to another conception, a kingdom of ends. By a kingdom, in this translation on the screen, it's called a realm, but same concept. I understand the union of different rational beings in a system of common laws. If we abstract from the personal differences of rational beings and likewise from all the content of their private ends, we shall be able to conceive all ends combined in a systemic whole. We can conceive a kingdom of, or realm of ends, which on the preceding principles is possible. So this is where Kant seems to bring a further, in my interpretation, social dimension to the categorical imperative, and I would say almost a political one. He seems to be sketching out a government based on consensus of what the duties are following from universal law, especially the one, as stated, that he kind of repeats when talking about the realm of ends, all rational beings come under the law that each of them must treat itself and all others never merely as means, but in every case at the same time as ends in themselves. So he's envisioning a quote unquote systematic union of rational beings by common objective laws, i.e., a kingdom which may be called a kingdom of ends. So what these laws have in view is the relation of these beings to one another as ends and means. Okay, I'm a bit confused about the use of the word means there, but he's envisioning a sort of realm where all rational humans meet each other as ends and seem to come to consensus about what duties are and what the categorical imperative commands them to do. This sounds a lot like the United Nations to me, but you all tell me what are political ramifications of Kant's moral law, and can one put, this is a topic that is as controversial as it comes, but I'm fine talking about it if all of you are. If you could put the war in Israel and Gaza right now in terms of Kant, I am all ears.
I guess in one the respect aspect of Kant, a lot of I would say like a lot of like countries don't really, I guess, would respect the like law of the UN and stuff, and like see the Palestinian people as like actual governing people.
The United Nations is full of problems. I mean,
Yeah.
there have been multiple human rights crises where the United Nations seems like it's been incapable of acting. There are also cases where it seems like it has been capable of acting, or if you can look at other international institutions like the International Court for Human Rights, the title of which I may have gotten wrong, the one at The Hague. So there seem to have been attempts at establishing some kind of universal moral law. Maya, I see your hand raised.
I think I'm just kind of confused about what exactly the third formulation is. I mean, I think I do understand the second one, and I feel like, yeah, with Israel and Gaza and Hamas, I don't know that I would say that anyone's really been particularly following that one. But I don't really understand. Yeah, I don't understand the third one.
Yeah. The best I could try to interpret it is that it is Kant putting the categorical imperative in a basically political context and just articulating what it means further to apply the categorical imperative when it's human to human. I'm not sure how better to put it. So look at this phrase: the idea of the will of every rational being as a will giving universal law. I mean, he's kind of already stated that his categorical imperative, by definition, is a universal moral law. But I think this articulation does nothing other than emphasize each rational being contributes to that universal law. And after that, it's really subject to interpretation to me. It's
Okay.
what does it mean to be a rational being giving universal law? I mean, I think it implies, I can only think of it as in political terms, that Kant is just suggesting a relationship, that the categorical imperative implies a relationship between all members of humanity as equal lawgivers about what the law is. Does that sort of make sense? Because I'm not sure it does.
So like sort of not encoding like biases, I guess, into your law and sort of treating everyone like human beings under it.
That sounds right.
Like I'm thinking about like not just necessarily Israel and Palestine, but like racism, homophobia, misogyny, you know, all sorts of transphobia, all sorts of different biases that like even in America we're encoding into law.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, no, that's helpful to me. I think this sort of third set of formulations of the categorical imperative posits a hypothetical political legal realm in which all of the agents are acting on the categorical imperative and provides a standard against which to compare existing laws. So this Kant's realm might just be in the noumenal world of thought, but I think it's perfectly respectable to ask if there were a realm of rational moral lawgivers, what laws would they create? And how do they compare to actual real world laws? And the reason I was like going on about the United Nations is that I take the United Nations to be an attempt at creating something like a universal government of equals. It's definitely failed a lot and has all kinds of problems and political agendas and stuff. But maybe, I mean, I think the way you were starting to put it, Maya, actually probably gets us closer to what Kant has in mind, is that there's this hypothetical realm of lawmakers that are totally guided by the categorical imperative. But I have it's these formulations that are the tricky ones to me. Is there anything in the chat? I think I'll wind down this half of class just by saying, so try to bring it to focus these different formulations of the imperative. Kant insists, strangely enough, that there are really so many different aspects of the same law, although they do seem to say somewhat different things. But the way they complement each other, according to him, is that the first formulation act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law is the form of the categorical imperative. The second formulation, act so you use humanity as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time as end and never merely as means. That is the kind of matter, or that's like the content of the universal moral law according to Kant. And that's what that last pair of formulations that Kant provides what he terms a complete determination of the categorical imperative, what might be considered the ultimate form, the ultimate outcome, consequence of the categorical imperative, this kind of hypothetical realm of rational lawgivers coming into unity. Okay, so this, again, it's the third part that's trickiest, but this would be how Kant understands the formulations as complementing each other. And I think with that, let's see how we're doing on time. Let's pause here and take a short break of maybe 5 minutes, and you can wind down any thoughts about Kant and then move on to John Stuart Mill, who very much goes hand in hand with Kant, I would say. So it's now 3:22. Let's pause and come back at 3:27. So see you all soon.